Hey guys, we are going to start with chapter 24, fluid balance, and then we'll move on to chapter 23, the urinary system. I think that this chapter 24 is a little bit more friendly and has a lot of the same concepts that you'll be using in the next chapter. Okay. So, cellular function requires a fluid medium with a carefully controlled composition. So this means that inside each cell there is a fluid medium, which would be the cytosol. And this fluid medium needs to be at a carefully controlled composition. And of course, this is called homeostasis. So there are three main types of homeostatic balance, which are the fluid balance, electrolyte balance, and acid-base balances. And these are maintained by different actions from different systems, including the urinary, respiratory, digestive, skin, or integumentary, endocrine, nervous, cardiovascular, lymphatic systems. So basically, every single system within your body plays a role in maintaining these three types of homeostasis. So we'll talk about fluid balance first. So as you guys know, just because you guys are all presumably human, humans have a lot of water. So newborn baby is about 75% water by weight, with men being more water, and that's because they have more muscle, women having a little bit less than males, and obese or elderly people having even less. So the total body weight of a 150-pound male is about 40 liters of water, which is quite a bit of water. And these are all contained within major fluid compartments in the body. So most of it goes to intracellular fluid, which is the fluid within the cell, which would be something like cytosol, with about 35% of it being extracellular fluid, which means that it's outside of the cell. So most of that is the tissue or interstitial fluid, which is just the fluid that floats around in the tissue right outside the cells. And then we also have blood plasma and lymphatic fluid, and then transcellular fluid, which would just be anything else. That would be cerebrospinal fluid, synovial fluid within your joints, peritoneal fluid, which is within your peritoneal cavity, pleural, pericardial fluids, which if you remember, these function to help with friction, things like that. We also have humors in the eye, and then bile and fluids in the digestive, urinary, reproductive tract. So there's a lot of fluid going on in the body. So fluid isn't just sitting there. It's continually being exchanged between compartments. If you remember from maybe basic science classes or what we've talked about in here, is that water moves mostly by osmosis. So water is able to easily move through membranes, but the osmotic gradients, which remember, of course, water would flow with against the gradient so that it would be going to somewhere where there's low amount of water. So because water can move through the membranes pretty easily, these osmotic gradients never really last long. So it means that there's generally it's going to be equal. So if there is an imbalance, then osmosis will restore that balance within several seconds. So the intracellular and extracellular osmolarity are equal. I wanted to bring that osmolarity, that word into for you guys to notice. Osmolarity is basically the amount of stuff within water, the amount of solute within a solution. So osmosis from one fluid compartment to another is determined by the relative concentrations of solutes. So that means that if there's a difference in the concentrations of solutes, then osmosis is going to try to make that equal. So this is mostly because of electrolytes. These are the main solutes that are within the fluid. So electrolytes are the most abundant solute particles by far. And this is mostly sodium salts in the extracellular fluid and potassium salts in intracellular fluid. So if I were to ask a question like, Where is sodium highest, intracellular, extracellular? You would say extracellular, whereas potassium is higher within the cells than outside of the cells. So electrolytes play the main role in governing where water goes because water will follow the electrolytes. So every single day, we are continuously gaining and hopefully, or losing and hopefully gaining water. So fluid balance itself is when daily gains and losses are equal. So gains come from two sources. There's preformed water, which is what you drink or eat, and then there's also metabolic water, which is a byproduct of aerobic metabolism and dehydration synthesis. There are several animals who can get by, like the kangaroo rat. They can get by without drinking any water, and this is mostly because they survive on metabolic water. Humans are not one of these. So sensible water loss is water loss that's observable. So this is urine, feces, and sweat that you're noticing is coming out of you. But there's also insensible water loss, which is the unnoticed water loss. So this would be within just transpiration that's diffusing through your skin that you're not really noticing. It doesn't come from the sweat glands. And then also within your breath. There's water that's coming out when you're talking, when you're breathing, things like that. And the loss will vary with environment and activity. So if you can imagine, if you're in a hot environment, of course you're going to lose more water. Whereas if you're in a colder, maybe more humid environment, you're not going to lose as much water. So definitely know where our sources of water are and where we're losing it. I don't expect you to know the exact numbers here, but I would want you to know that as far as gains, metabolic water only accounts for a tiny little bit, whereas the ingested preformed water is the majority of water that we're intaking. And most of the water output is in the form of sensible water loss, with most of it being in urine. So the regulation of fluid intake is mostly governed by thirst. So you're going to intake fluid when you're thirsty, obviously. Dehydration functions to reduce blood volume and blood pressure and will increase the blood osmolarity because there's not as much water. So you want to prevent this dehydration. So the body can sense dehydration with osmoreceptors that are located within the hypothalamus. These respond to angiotensin II when blood pressure drops, and it also responds to a rise in osmolarity of the extracellular fluid. We'll talk more about the angiotensin II later in this lecture, as well as in the kidney lectures, but you will need to know this hormone. So osmoreceptors then communicate with other hypothalamic neurons and with the cerebral cortex to produce the sensation of thirst. So something that's really important that I do want you guys to know is the hormone, antidiuretic hormone, ADH. We've talked about this before. So if you remember from that, the hypothalamus produces ADH and then it sends it to the posterior pituitary where it's released. And ADH does exactly what it sounds like. It's antidiuretic. So it promotes water conservation. The cerebral cortex itself produces the conscious sense of thirst. So that's not just like the primal drive from the hypothalamus. And salivation becomes inhibited with thirst so that your mouth gets dry when you're thirsty, and that makes you really want to drink. And this is because of sympathetic signals from the thirst center to the salivary glands. And this sympathetic innervation is also why when you're nervous, your mouth becomes dry. So there's two forms of thirst inhibition. So there's long-term inhibition of thirst, and this is when the absorption of water from the small intestine reduces the osmolarity of blood as the small intestine intakes more water. And this will stop the osmoreceptor response within the hypothalamus and will make saliva more abundant, watery, and that'll decrease the actual sensation of thirst. But this requires, because it has to go to the small intestine, this requires 30 minutes or longer to take effect. My question here, where is dietary water absorbed? If you remember from our digestion lecture, that's absorbed within the small and large intestines, but mostly the small intestine. So there's also short-term inhibition of thirst, which is the actual cooling and moistening of water, of the mouth, which will quench your thirst. So that's when you go to drink water, and it's you can immediately sense that your thirst is becoming isn't you're not as thirsty. So it's also coming from the distension of the stomach and small intestine. So you're sensing that your stomach and small intestine are full. Um, and this lasts about 30 to 45 minutes of satisfaction. So this needs to be followed by water being absorbed into the bloodstream by the small intestine, or thirst will return. So this short-term response is designed to prevent over drinking. And we'll talk about why over drinking can be a problem as far as fluid balance. So I want you to know the different ways of that we sense thirst, and how this plays a role in rehydration and fluid balance.